Welcome to Talking Points. We may know much more about the Soviet propaganda system, or perhaps the Nazi Germany brainwashing slogans, than we actually do about the Chinese propaganda. And that's because the Chinese Communist propaganda system manifests in more than just words and slogans. As America's biggest adversary, perhaps its biggest in history, the CCP directly threatens the very fabric of this society. So it is a top priority to study and understand the machines that are the CCP's propaganda departments. Perhaps, with the help from today's expert, you and I can both learn about this multi-dimensional propaganda war the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, has waged, not only on its own people, but also on everybody in the world, especially the United States. I'm joined today by Dr. Antonio Graceffo, a China expert who has spent over 20 years in Asia. He works as an economics professor and China economic analyst. His writings on China include Beyond the Belt and Road, China's Global Economic Expansion, and a short course on the Chinese economy. Join us for part 1, China's Internal and External War of Propaganda. Thank you so much for joining me today. Do you mind giving us a brief overview as to exactly how the Chinese propaganda system or even the media system operates domestically?
Sure. So domestically, what happens is when you have a job in China, you're assigned to a work unit. And then through the work unit, they would have, for example, ideological meetings, and they would read Xi Jinping thought, and they would have discussions. Through those work units, the propaganda is sort of handed down for the week, for the month. So when I was at the university, for example, I didn't attend those meetings, but I attended department meetings, and then the people at the department meetings had already attended the ideology meeting, right? So we would have a meeting, and suddenly something would come out that was the propaganda for that week or that month. Maybe it was prosperous society, was the thing. Or I remember when there was a dispute between China and Japan, and suddenly there was all this propaganda about Japan. I remember one time I was talking, a stranger actually, a taxi driver, asked me something about Mao Zedong, and we started talking, and then suddenly he said, it's like he's spitting out something that's been programmed. He goes, Mao Zedong, 70% good, 30% bad. And then I knew that was the propaganda that week. And then, I heard that 4 or 5 more times in the same day. So they'll sort of pick these sayings, these phrases, and they'll kind of come down, and that's what you have to do.
So there is actually a direction that dictates what to say, right?
When I was at School of Economics, my original dissertation topic was the Belt and Road Initiative, because that's what I had been working on for years. I've been writing about the Belt and Road Initiative, but I was also writing about the U.S.-China trade war, and suddenly they called me in and they said, can you write everything about the trade war? And then one time they called me in and they said, this week we need you to write something about the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, and it must be a positive story. So they would basically dictate what research outcomes we were going to have. This is economic research in School of Economics, Shanghai University, and they would dictate what the outcomes were going to be, and the outcomes would then match whatever the propaganda was for the week. All the news media is effectively controlled by the government, or owned by the government, or controlled by the government, and of course, the news media will always will never contradict the government line, and will often parrot the government line. So each week when the news comes out, or each day, you can read it and you can kind of get a feeling for which way the propaganda is going that way.
So what are the effects of internal propaganda then?
And a lot of the internal is about rewriting history. There's so much of history that people in China just don't know about because, it's suppressed. And there are cases where they knew about it, but then the narrative changed. So they had to very quickly tell everybody a different history. And it just amazed me when I was at the sports university. I spent 3 years at the Shanghai University of Sport, and then 3 years at Shanghai University School of Economics. And between those two experiences, the 6 years, it just boggled my mind, some of the propaganda that came out. And when I was studying economics, obviously everywhere in the world, when you study economics, you study Western economics. But my classmates also had to study Marxist economics. And so we would be in an economics lecture in the morning. And, my classmates are all clever people. They're good at mathematics and, they're doing very well in the courses. And that course would end at 10 o'clock, and then they'd have to go to the Marxist economics class. And I always wondered, how did they reconcile that in their brains? That everything they were told from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock in the morning, which they know is what they're going to need for a job for the rest of their lives, that conflicted with what they were told from 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock in their Marxism class. And in the Marxism class, they would just memorize whatever it was they were told, spit it out on the exams, say it with gusto, and then let it go. And then just never think about it again, never use it for anything again. But that was yet another form of propaganda that they used.
So how does that work externally?
As far as the external propaganda, it is just amazing that it is all enabled, or much of it is enabled by Western actors motivated by profit, promoting the Chinese CCP line, whatever the Communist Party of China, whatever the line is that they're promoting that week, and they're basically paying people in the West to parrot it, to repeat it. So, one of the most blatant ones, of course, is that the CCP has paid or had paid inserts in magazines and newspapers all over the world. All of the major media were accepting these paid inserts. They're almost like infomercials, that they appeared to be news stories, but they were actually paid. And it would have whatever the propaganda was that week. They would disseminate it that way. Then in the West, particularly in the United States, you have this woke culture, this sort of leftist movement going on in the United States, and that winds up supporting a lot of the CCP narratives. And there's a bit of a conspiracy theory, if you will, but it's probably true, which is that the CCP knows that this is going on, and then they promote or they introduce certain ideas into the woke ideology or into the left ideology in the United States, which is actually CCP ideology, and then it gets repeated through Americans that are actually not being paid or are just ideologically aligned with the CCP, but they may not realize that that's what they're doing. They're sort of unwitting actors in that case. There's also the Wu Mao. So you have this Wu Mao army, which no one knows the exact numbers. I've heard there's hundreds of thousands. I've heard there's millions, whatever the number is. But there are people in China that are paid Wu Mao, which is 50 cents, 50 Chinese cents, so half a yuan. But they're paid for each post that they do on the internet. And they'll go on Twitter. And it's also funny because Twitter is banned in China, and yet these people work on Twitter. So clearly, these people are working in cooperation with the government. They have access to Twitter. They have access to, I think, also Facebook, YouTube, things like that. But particularly, this happens a lot on Twitter. They go on Twitter. They post the party line, whatever the line is that week. Like during the pandemic, it was just every week there was something new, and a lot of times it was discrediting Secretary Pompeo or discrediting President Trump, or introducing misinformation, that evidence that the CCP virus, that the coronavirus, that it started in Spain or something, and then they'll have all this evidence that it actually came from Spain, it actually came from Italy.
Now, you mentioned there's a Soviet strategy where they would employ sort of those, mess everything up so nothing becomes true, right?
Yes.
Now, what we're trying to get with the Soviet propaganda is that, have you seen any of this stuff being specific examples being used to stir things up when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, like muddying the water just so that everybody's confused?
Well, definitely all during the pandemic. There were reports of hospitals overwhelmed and people dying in the corridors and things like that, and those were coming out of Wu Mao accounts. During the election, and the aftermath of the U.S. election, I saw there were a lot of, this was very clever. There were accounts that were saying that they had uncovered voter fraud, and they had evidence of voter fraud, and it's going to be released on Monday, or this is going to be the nail in the coffin. And then you look at the account; it had 2 or 3 followers, and basically this was the Wu Mao presenting evidence, or alleged evidence, right, to either get conservatives to go down a rabbit hole that wasn't true, or to get liberals to look at that and say, oh, this account is fake, this evidence is fake, therefore all claims of election fraud are fake, and then to just disbelieve anything. And you could have come out with the smoking gun at that point, and they just wouldn't believe it. So I definitely saw that during the election. I saw a lot of that, where suddenly I would read something and get very hopeful. I'm like, oh my goodness, oh, they have real evidence. And then I'm like, oh, this is one of those Wu Mao accounts. And then during the pandemic, it was just horrible. It was just so blatant. There were so many. Oh, and during the BLM riots too. Like I said, there were a lot of reports, of weird arrests and this and that, and then you follow up on it, and it just, none of it was true. And then it was so exhausting that at some point you just give up, and you're just going to stop investigating. You're going to stop asking questions, and you're just going to accept whatever's going on.
Can you give us an example of this?
Very interesting. If you study the propaganda that was used in the Soviet Union, a lot of times the propaganda is there to make you believe something that may not be true. However, there's another propaganda strategy, which is to tell you things that are untrue, that you probably won't believe. But now it discredits the entire, the media, the blogosphere, the Twitter sphere. Suddenly you don't believe anything anymore because you've read ridiculous statements. If you suddenly start reading, there's evidence that the CCP virus came from Spain. There's evidence that it came from the United States. It was transmitted by goats to humans. Just ridiculous things. And then at that point, you stop believing anything. So that's also part of the strategy. It's just to get you to stop believing credible reports. But then during the George Floyd, the BLM, and I was reading the stuff that was coming out from these Wu Mao accounts, I just couldn't believe how good it actually was. But they would always give themselves away. Like, first of all, the Wu Mao accounts would always have very few followers. The accounts were often new. You look at the date, and they've only been on Twitter for 2 weeks. They have 0 followers. They're following 3,000 people. And the biographical information, like it'll say, oh, they're located in Texas and they're American, and then their name will be some name that just makes no sense, or like some famous person's name or whatever, George Soros or whatever. And so then you're suspicious of this account, and then it's immediately parroting sort of CCP phrase of the week. So what I would often do is I'd copy whatever they were saying, and then I would search it, and then sure enough, that would pop up on that same statement, or the same wording would pop up on like 50 accounts or 100 accounts, and then you would know, okay, that was the propaganda that week. But there's basically this 2-pronged approach. There's the internal approach, and then there's the external.
I've noticed that whenever I've discussed China with a peer that doesn't really know about China, they would just say, China is growing and China's economy is great. Shanghai has a beautiful skyline and everything like that. But when it comes to judging their governments, or the Chinese government judging the Chinese system, they seem to want to avoid this topic because it somehow feels like they're offending people they're not. They're not really at ease with criticizing China.
You said something that was interesting. You said that some liberals will say to you, Shanghai is great, it's the most wonderful city, and China raised all these people out of poverty. And then you say to them, well, you do realize Chinese citizens are not allowed to move freely within their own country. They don't have the freedoms that we do. And then they get uncomfortable because it's like you're criticizing China. That's something else. Beijing has figured out that CCP has figured out that we have this sort of this woke culture where we don't want to offend anybody. We don't want to criticize anything. and Beijing exploits that as well. And like every time somebody tells me China raised X number of people out of poverty, I always say to them, well, why did they have that many people in poverty to begin with? There was no reason. They didn't have to have that number of people in poverty. Or they'll say, oh, China's amazing. In 1990, they were, the third poorest country on the planet, and now they're the second richest. And I go, okay, but there was no reason for them to be the third poorest country in 19. They didn't have to be. They chose to be, right? And that's an example of sort of woke propaganda, right? Because you're not supposed to criticize that. You're not supposed to point at that and blame them. Oh, you're victim shaming or something like that, which is ridiculous. I mean, I think it's a legitimate question. Why were you the third poorest country in 1990? You didn't have to be, right? Deng Xiaoping liberalized the economy, in 1978. I'm like, 1978? So basically what we're saying is in 1978, they were able to get the Chinese economy to a point where the U.S. economy was in 1783 or something. This is when you have these conversations with what we call China apologists, you know that they're just falling for this propaganda. They just, Shanghai's great, China's great. I've had so many people tell me China's not communist anymore. What are you, nuts? I go, there is only one party. I mean, effectively one party, right? I've written on this topic too. There's actually, I believe, 8. I think there's 7 minority parties, and then there's a communist party. However, the 7 minority parties have to agree to the leading role of the CCP, and it would be illegal for the 7 minority parties to sort of plan to displace the CCP. So at the end of the day, you have an effective one-party system. But I love it because if you accidentally say on Twitter, on Facebook, on social media, China is a one-party system, immediately a Wu Mao will jump in and say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. China has 7 parties or 8 parties. It's almost like they're planting these little seeds. They're waiting for you to trip up, and then they're going to catch you. And then, I was doing business. I was speaking at a conference. In fact, I was speaking at an investor conference in Suzhou, and the Americans who put on the conference said to me, "Oh yeah, China's not even communist anymore." Well, what are you kidding? There's only one party. It's the Communist Party. No, but look at the people. They're free and they're moving around and they're making profit and this and that. I'm like, you just don't understand it. Deng Xiaoping said, Deng Xiaoping liberalized the economy. Deng Xiaoping is also the person who essentially ordered the Tiananmen Square massacre. And that event, those two facts, the fact that he liberalized the economy, the fact that he suppressed any sort of pro-democracy or pro-rights protest, sends the exact message that he wanted, which is liberalization of the economy is not equal to liberalization of the social society or politics. The political system remains intact. CCP rules the country. There is the CCP. There is nothing else. Everything serves the CCP. Everything serves the party. And we're going to liberalize the economy because we want you to get rich and to bring money in for the country. But this is not equal to allowing freedom of speech. This is not equal to allowing freedom of movement. This is not equal to having multiple parties, allowing you to protest the central government. No, none of that. And this is the nuance, this is the point that the CCP apologists miss. And a lot of it is because they buy into propaganda.
So how does China use these comparisons to their advantage to talk about how great China is?
Sister cities, and they'll bring the mayors of American cities to China, and they'll show them all these wonderful things in China. And these mayors inevitably will do either a blog post or a public statement. They'll go, wow, I went to China. I wish we were doing as well as them in education. I wish we were doing as well as them in, whatever it is, building infrastructure. I wish we had as many high-speed trains as they do. I'm an economist. Do you know how many times I've had to look at the high-speed train issue? Do you know why the United States doesn't have high-speed trains? Because we do not need them. the only part of the United States where a high-speed train would have any viability is the Northeast corridor between New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. However, because of noise ordinances, because of the number of stops it would have to make in order to be profitable, the very, 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 very expensive high-speed train would actually only get you from New York to D.C. about 15 or 20 minutes faster than the current train. But meanwhile, it would cost millions and millions and millions of dollars to build it, and then the ticket price would be double what it is right now, and that's why we don't have high-speed trains. Japan offered us high-speed trains in the 70s or the 80s when they were making high-speed trains. But that's an example of there are Wu Mao accounts that go on Twitter and say, America is a third world country. Look at China. China has high-speed rail because our government loves us. You have two parties, but they're both bad. We have one party, but they gave us high-speed trains. Or they'll have a picture of like the worst, Grand Central Station, not Grand Central Station, let's say Penn Station in New York City. At 2:00 in the morning on a Saturday, they'll have a picture of what that looks like. Or like the worst subway station in New York, they'll have a picture of that. And then they'll have a picture of like the high-speed rail in China. And they'll go, oh, really? Tell us how you believe the U.S. is better, or how you have more freedoms, right? So that would be an example of, this is propaganda, right? This is propaganda. And then liberals, and not just liberals, lots of people fall for it and they repeat it. Yeah, why don't we have, high-speed rail like that? Well, we don't have it because we don't need it, High-speed rail is a really good example. There's a lot of other examples. The education one, I've written so many papers on education. There's the PISA, which is the international scoring system, ranking system for schools. And countries select schools that will represent the country for the PISA. So China picks the best school in Shanghai to represent China, and then China beats the U.S. in the PISA score. And China then says, oh, China has a better education system than the U.S. This is why you're falling behind. And then liberals pick this up, right? And self-loathing Americans pick this up. They go, oh, I wish we could learn from China how to do education. And I've written so many papers on this. I said, no, the PISA score proves that the best school in Shanghai is better than the average school in the United States. The best schools in the United States are the best schools in the world. There's schools in Maryland. Maryland, as a state, went and took the PISA exam and beat out every country in the world, the state of Maryland. But, I've been in rural China. They still have one-room schoolhouses. In a significant part of the country, there are one-room schoolhouses where you have a 7-year-old and maybe an 18 or 19-year-old in the same class, one teacher. The teachers, it's another thing. Like the teachers only have 2 years of higher education. They don't necessarily have a 4-year degree. They have chalkboards. They have, for example, I was building a school in China that wanted to be able to give a New York high school diploma in China. Well, the requirements for New York high school diploma, among other things, is that you have to do certain experiments in your science classes. There's, say, 4 or 5 experiments that are mandatory. You have to do the experiment. You write the lab book. It has to be signed off by a teacher who's certified. And we started ordering all the chemicals and the things we needed to make the labs. And next thing I know, we're receiving a message from the government basically saying, oh, schools in China are not allowed to have chemicals. They're not allowed to have the machinery that you want to have. So that says to me that no school in China, no high school, is doing these experiments. And then I went to high school in one of the worst, I went to high school in rural Tennessee. I'm from New York, but I attended high school in rural Tennessee. And we did those experiments. We did, we dissected a pig. We did whatever in chemistry class. We had physics labs. We had all those labs, even in my poor school that was in the middle of, the Appalachian Mountains. We had all of that. So my school, my relatively poor school in Tennessee was better than any school in China, if that was the metric that you're going by.
Dr. Graceffo discussed various examples of China's propaganda invasion into the Western world, confusing Americans on the state of China, on the state of the United States, and they do so to overthrow the legitimacy of the liberal societies. In doing so, they must have a mission, right? Find out more in our part 2 of this interview. We'll discuss what China capitalizes on in the United States to cause this chaos, including a focus on soft propaganda, Hollywood, and media journalism. And that is it for today. Thanks so much for watching this episode. If you enjoy the content, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment below. Share the video with your friends on social media and follow us at Twitter, Parler, and Telegram. In any case, if you disappear from YouTube, you can find us at the following places. We upload videos to Maker, and we have an email newsletter link for you to sign up to stay updated on this channel. Thanks once again for watching. Have a good night. Take care.